The letter that would ruin Simon Underwood's life arrived folded twice and sealed with a smear of candle wax, and he had no notion, as he slid it open with his thumbnail beneath the cottonwood outside the bunkhouse, that inside those few penciled lines lay the seeds of the sweetest trouble he would ever know. The year was 1878, and the Barkay Ranch sprawled across the dry grass hills of the Wyoming Territory like a patchwork quilt thrown carelessly over the land. Seams of barbed wire and cattle trail stitching together 9,000 acres of hard living. Simon Underwood was 26 years old, lean as a fence post, with ink-stained fingers and a mind that had always run faster than his mouth could keep up with. He had come west from Ohio 4 years back, following a dream of land that had never quite materialized, and had settled instead into the quieter work of keeping books and writing letters for men who could rope a steer in the dark, but could not spell their own names in daylight. Chief among those men was Garrett Boone, foreman of the Barkay, a bear of a man with hands like slabs of cured beef and a heart, Simon had come to learn, softer than anyone who looked at him would guess. Boone could read brands from 100 yards and could tell a storm was coming 3 days before the sky darkened, but put a pencil in his hand and ask him to write his own name, and the man's face would redden like a branding iron left too long in the fire. "You are certain this is proper?" Boone said that morning, standing in the doorway of the small room Simon used as an office, twisting his hat brim between his fingers. "A man writing to a woman he has never laid eyes on." "It is done all the time, Mr. Boone," Simon said, setting the letter aside and reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "Half the marriages in this territory started with words on a page. The newspaper back east runs advertisements for it every week. Lonely men, lonely women, and a bit of honesty between them before they ever meet in the flesh. And you will write what I tell you, not what you think sounds pretty." Simon smiled, though something in his chest tightened at the question, some small warning he did not yet understand. "I will write your words, Mr. Boone. I only smooth the edges." Boone had placed an advertisement 3 months prior in a matrimonial paper that circulated through Kansas and Missouri, seeking a wife willing to come west and take up a rancher's life. He had received but one reply worth pursuing, from a young woman named Lydia Collins of Independence, Missouri, whose letter had described herself as capable, hardworking, and unafraid of solitude, having buried both her parents to the fever 2 winters past, and having kept house for her uncle since. She was 22 years old, she wrote, and she wished for a home of her own and a husband who would treat her with kindness. Boone had been struck dumb reading it, or rather hearing it, since Simon had read it aloud to him twice, and had asked Simon to compose a reply that very afternoon. That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, 4 more letters had passed between Independence and the Barkay, each one dictated by Boone in halting, awkward phrases about the weather and the cattle and the size of the house he was building, and each one transformed by Simon's pen into something warmer, something that spoke of longing and hope, and a man's quiet devotion to a woman he had never met. Simon told himself it was only kindness. Boone felt things he could not say, and Simon merely gave those feelings the words they deserved. But as he dipped his pen now and began to write, he found himself thinking not of Boone's gruff affection, but of his own, of the strange ache that had settled in him with each letter Lydia Collins sent back, full of wit and warmth and a courage that leapt off the page despite her plain, careful hand. "Tell her," Boone said now, settling his bulk into the room's single chair, "tell her I am glad she is coming. Tell her the house will be ready. Tell her," he paused, working his jaw. "Tell her I look forward to knowing her," Simon wrote. He wrote of the golden light that fell across the hills in autumn, of the small storm cellar Boone had dug that spring, of the promise a man could make to a woman he had chosen sight unseen, that he would be patient and gentle, and would build her a life worth having. He signed it, as he always did, Garrett Boone, though the words beneath that name were his own heart bleeding onto paper meant for another man's bride. He did not know, could not have known, that in a small rented room above a dry goods store in Independence, Missouri, a young woman with chestnut hair and steady gray eyes was reading his words by lamplight and pressing the letter to her chest, as though she could feel the pulse of the man who had written them. Lydia Collins had grown up believing that love was a thing that happened to other people, softer people, women who had not spent their girlhood scrubbing floors and stretching flour to feed a household that never seemed to have enough. Her parents had died within a week of each other during the influenza that swept through Missouri in 1876, and she had gone to live with her father's brother, a dry goods merchant named Wendell Collins, a decent enough man but distracted always by his ledgers and his debts. She kept his house, cooked his meals, and minded his two young sons, and in the evenings when the work was finally done, she read. She had answered the advertisement in the matrimonial paper on a whim, half embarrassed by her own desperation, never expecting a reply. When Garrett Boone's first letter arrived, she had read it 3 times before she believed it was truly meant for her. It was clumsy in places, she thought, but there was something honest in it, something that spoke of a man unused to expressing himself who was trying, earnestly, to reach across the miles toward her. But it was the second letter that undid her entirely. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday, and she read it standing in the doorway of the shop while her uncle argued with a supplier over the price of tinned peaches, and by the time she reached the final line, tears stood in her eyes, though she could not have said precisely why. I have built you a garden, though nothing grows in it yet but hope. I think of you turning the soil there in the spring, your hands in the earth, and I find myself wishing for spring sooner than I ever have in my life. I do not know your face, Miss Collins, but I believe I am coming to know your heart, and I find it a fine thing to know. She had never read words like that. She had certainly never received words like that addressed to her, meant for her alone. She wrote back that same night, pouring out things she had never told another living soul, her fear of being unwanted, her hope of finding a place where she belonged, her small dream of a garden of her own. She did not know that the man reading her words back at the barquet was not the man who would receive her when the stagecoach finally rolled in, that the voice she had fallen for existed only on paper, born from another man's pen. The wedding was arranged for the second week of October, when the last of the roundup would be finished, and Boone could spare the time to travel to the territorial seat and back with his bride. Lydia would travel by rail as far as Cheyenne, and then by stagecoach the remaining distance to the small town of Larkspur, nearest the barquet, where Boone would meet her. As the date approached, Simon found himself writing more letters than Boone had ever asked for, staying up past midnight by lamplight, composing lines he told himself were simply thorough, simply generous, simply what a good scribe did for a man who could not do it himself. He wrote of the mountains turning purple at dusk. He wrote of a cottonwood tree he thought she might like to sit beneath. He wrote once, without quite meaning to, that he could not wait to see what kind of woman would look at a stranger's ranch and call it home, and had to scratch it out and begin the line again, because it was too much himself and not enough Boone, and he was terrified, suddenly, of being caught. "You are quiet tonight," said Hattie Voss, the ranch's cook, a widow of 50 who had taken a motherly interest in Simon since his arrival and missed nothing. She set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of him in the cookhouse, where he had taken to eating alone most evenings while he worked on his correspondence. "Something troubling you, Mr. Underwood?" "Only tired, Mrs. Voss," Simon said, though he did not look up from the letter before him. "Tired," Hattie repeated, and there was a knowing edge to her voice that made him glance up despite himself. "You have been tired every night this week, and every night you are writing that girl's letters like a man composing his own love notes." "They are Mr. Boone's letters," Simon said, too quickly. Said Hattie, and left it at that, though the look she gave him as she walked away told him she believed nothing of the sort. The stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived in Larkspur on a bright, cold morning in mid-October, dust rising behind it like a banner announcing the end of something and the beginning of something else. Boone had asked Simon to accompany him into town, ostensibly to help with the paperwork at the land office. But in truth, Simon suspected, because Boone was nervous as a colt and wanted a familiar face beside him when he finally met the woman he had been courting by proxy for 2 months. Simon stood beside the wagon in the dusty street, his hat pulled low against the sun, and watched the stagecoach rattle to a stop before the mercantile. The door opened, and a young woman stepped down, and Simon Underwood felt something in his chest simply stop working correctly. Some gear that had turned reliably for 26 years, grinding suddenly to a halt. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings called beautiful, not delicate or fragile, but there was a strength in her face, in the set of her jaw, in the steady way her gray eyes swept the street and settled, finally, on Boone standing awkward and enormous beside the wagon. Her chestnut hair was pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and she wore a traveling dress of blue calico that had clearly been mended more than once, and she looked, Simon thought, exactly like every word she had ever written him, honest and unadorned and entirely herself. "Mr. Boone," she said, and her voice was low and clear, carrying easily across the space between them. "Miss Collins," Boone said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest like a man at a funeral, which struck Simon, watching, as somehow both comic and tender. "I am glad you have come." Lydia's eyes moved past Boone then to Simon standing near the wagon, and for one long moment her gaze held his, and Simon felt the strangest certainty that she was searching for something in his face, though he could not have said what. "And you are?" she asked. "Simon Underwood, ma'am. I keep the books at the Barquet." He extended his hand, and when she took it, her grip was firm, her palm calloused in a way that told him she had done real work in her life, and he found himself unable to look away from her face for perhaps a second too long. "Mr. Underwood," she said, and something crossed her expression, quick as a bird's shadow, gone before he could name it. "Mr. Boone has written to me of you. He says you are a fine hand with a pen." "I do my best, ma'am," Simon said, and felt his face heat, though he could not have said why a simple compliment should undo him so. Boone stepped forward then, clearing his throat, and the moment passed. "We have a preacher waiting, Miss Collins, if you are agreeable to the wedding taking place today, as we discussed in my letters." Lydia's gaze flickered once more towards Simon before settling on Boone, and something in her expression steadied, though Simon thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty pass through it first. "I am agreeable, Mr. Boone," she said. "That was the arrangement." They were married that same afternoon in the small clapboard church at the edge of Larkspur, the Reverend Amos Whitfield presiding over a ceremony attended by perhaps a dozen souls, mostly hands from the Barquet who had ridden in for the occasion, and a scattering of townsfolk curious to see the foreman's mail-order bride. Simon stood at the back of the church, his hat in his hands, and watched Lydia Collins become Lydia Boone, and told himself firmly that the tightness in his chest was nothing more than the dust of the road catching in his throat. She did not smile during the vows, he noticed. She spoke them clearly, steadily, but there was a distance in her eyes, as though some part of her stood apart from the proceedings, watching from a little way off. Boone, for his part, looked like a man who had been handed a gift too fine for his hands, careful and reverent and entirely unable to believe his good fortune. After the ceremony there was a small gathering at the hotel, cake and coffee and well wishes from the ranch hands, and it was there, in the crowded parlor, that Lydia found herself for a moment alone beside Simon, both of them having drifted to the edges of the celebration. "Mr. Underwood," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am." "The letters Mr. Boone sent me." She turned her cup of coffee slowly in her hands, not looking at him directly. "You wrote them, did you not? He told me on the ride from town that you set his words to paper since he does not read or write." Simon felt his stomach drop, though he kept his face carefully neutral. "I wrote what he told me to write, ma'am. Nothing more." "Nothing more," she repeated softly, and there was something in her voice that made him uneasy, though he could not name it. There was a line in one letter, about a garden, about hope growing there before anything else did. She looked up at him then, and her gray eyes were sharp, searching. "Did Mr. Boone tell you to write that, Mr. Underwood?" Simon's mouth went dry. He thought of lying, of saying yes, of course. Every word had come from Boone's own mouth, but something in her steady gaze made the lie curdle before he could speak it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "a man in my position must sometimes smooth the rough edges of another man's meaning. Mr. Boone feels a great deal. He simply lacks the words to say it as he wishes. I only tried to give voice to what I believed was already in his heart." It was not quite the truth, and not quite a lie, and Lydia studied him for a long moment as though weighing the difference. "That is a kind thing to do for a friend," she said finally, though her voice had cooled by several degrees, and she excused herself a moment later to speak with Hattie Voss, leaving Simon standing alone with his coffee going cold in his hand, and a feeling in his chest like he had swallowed a stone. He told himself, riding back to the bar K behind the wagon that carried Boone and his new bride, that this was how it should be. Boone was his friend, had given him work and a place to sleep when he had nothing, had never once treated him as less than an equal despite his own inability to read the simplest sign. Boone deserved happiness, deserved a wife who would fill his quiet house with warmth, and if that wife's affections had been won partly by Simon's own pen, then that was simply the nature of the arrangement, and Simon had no claim on feelings that had been offered, however unwittingly, to another man. But he could not stop thinking of the way she had looked at him in the church, the flicker of something searching in her eyes, and he wondered, with a guilt that sat heavy in his stomach, whether some small part of her had already begun to sense the truth of things, even before she had asked him outright. The house Boone had built stood a mile from the main bunkhouse, a solid structure of hewn logs and a real glass window facing east, so that the morning sun would fall across the kitchen floor. It was, Simon knew, because he had helped Boone plan it, built with genuine care, every joint fitted tight against the winter wind, and when Lydia stepped inside it for the first time, she made a small sound of surprise that Simon, standing outside with the other hands unloading her trunk, heard through the open door. "You did not tell me it was so fine," she said to Boone. "I did not know the words for it," Boone admitted, and there was an honesty in his voice that Simon, listening, found himself admiring despite the ache in his own chest. "I only knew I wanted you to have something good. It should have been enough." For a time, Simon believed it might be. Lydia settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a competence that surprised even Hattie Voss, who had expected, she admitted privately to Simon, a city girl too delicate for the work. Lydia rose before dawn to help with the milking, kept a garden behind the house that by November had already been turned and prepared for spring planting, and in the evenings could be found mending shirts or reading by the fire, her presence lending the ranch a warmth it had not known before. But the letters had not stopped. That was the trouble, the thing Simon had not anticipated. Boone, for all his devotion, remained a man who struggled to speak the tenderness he felt. And one evening, some 3 weeks after the wedding, he came to Simon's small office with his hat in his hands, and an expression of such helpless frustration that Simon nearly laughed despite himself. "She thinks I do not care for her the way I did in the letters," Boone said. "I can see it in her face. She looks at me sometimes like she is waiting for something, and I do not know what to give her." "Have you told her how you feel?" Simon asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I have tried. The words will not come, Simon. They never have. That is why I asked you to write for me in the first place." Boone's voice dropped, rough with something like shame. Could you write something for her still? Not to send by post, but for me to give her here, something to remind her of what I feel, since I cannot say it plain." Simon should have refused. He knew this, even as Boone asked it, felt the wrongness of it settle in his stomach like a swallowed coal. But Boone's face was so earnest, so plainly desperate to hold on to the happiness he had only just found, that Simon could not bring himself to deny him. "I will write something," Simon said quietly. "But Mr. Boone, these are your feelings I am putting to paper. You must mean them, or the words are worthless." "I mean every one," Boone said. "I only cannot find the shape of them myself." So Simon wrote again, another letter, though this one would not travel by post but would be pressed into Lydia's hands by her own husband. And Simon told himself once more that this was simply an act of friendship, a kindness done for a man who deserved happiness. He wrote of watching her in the garden at dusk, of the particular way she laughed when the ranch dog chased its tail, of 100 small things he had noticed about her in 3 short weeks, and it was only as he finished, reading the words back to himself in the lamplight, that he understood with a cold, sinking certainty that these were not observations he had invented for Boone's benefit. He had noticed these things himself. He had watched her in the garden. He had heard her laugh at the dog. Every word on the page was true, and every word belonged in his heart to him and not to Boone. He gave the letter to Boone anyway because he did not know what else to do, and told himself it was the last one he would ever write. It was not. Winter came hard to the Barquet that year, snow piling against the fence posts and the wind screaming down from the mountains with a fury that kept most of the hands close to the bunkhouse stove. Lydia, however, seemed unbothered by the cold, and took to walking the short distance to the ranch office most afternoons to help Simon with the account books, a task she had discovered she had a genuine talent for, her quick mind making short work of the ledgers that Simon had previously managed alone. "My uncle never trusted me with his figures," she told him one gray January afternoon, bent over a column of numbers with a small frown of concentration. "He said a woman's mind was not suited to sums. I always thought that was foolishness, but I never had the chance to prove it. You have proven it thoroughly, Mrs. Boone," Simon said, and something in the way he said her married name made her look up at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You may call me Lydia, Mr. Underwood, when we are working. It seems silly to be so formal when we spend so many afternoons together." "Then you must call me Simon," he said, and the exchange felt like something significant had shifted between them. Some small door opened that could not easily be closed again. They fell into an easy rhythm after that, working side by side through the long winter afternoons, and Simon found himself treasuring those hours more than he dared admit even to himself. Lydia spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of her parents, of the particular ache of losing them both within a week and being passed like unwanted furniture into her uncle's household. Simon spoke of Ohio, of a father who had wanted him to take over a modest farm that Simon had never wanted, of the restlessness that had driven him west in search of something he still had not entirely found. "And have you found it?" Lydia asked him once, looking up from the ledger with those steady gray eyes. "Whatever it was you came looking for." Simon held her gaze a moment too long before answering. "I am beginning to think I have found something," he said carefully, "though it was not quite what I expected to find." Lydia's cheeks colored, and she looked back down at the ledger quickly, and neither of them spoke of it further, though the air in the small office seemed charged with something neither was yet brave enough to name. It was Hattie Voss who finally forced the matter into the open, some 6 weeks into the new year, cornering Simon in the cookhouse one evening after Lydia had gone home to the main house, and Boone was out checking the herds against the cold. "You are in love with that girl," Hattie said without preamble, setting down a plate of stew before him with more force than necessary. "Do not trouble yourself denying it to me, Simon Underwood. I have eyes, and I have watched you moon over her like a schoolboy for 3 months now." "She is a married woman, Mrs. Voss," Simon said, staring at his stew rather than at her. "Married to my friend. Whatever I feel is my own burden to carry, and I intend to carry it quietly and let it pass." "And has it passed yet?" Simon said nothing, which was answer enough. "I thought as much," Hattie said, more gently now, sitting across from him at the rough plank table. "Simon, I will tell you something, and you will not like hearing it, but I mean it as kindness. That girl did not fall in love with Garrett Boone. She fell in love with the man who wrote those letters, and unless I am very much mistaken, some part of her has begun to suspect that man was never Boone at all." "She cannot know," Simon said, alarm sharpening his voice. "I have been careful." "You have been about as careful as a bull in a flower patch," Hattie said. "The way you two look at each other over those ledger books. Child, it is a wonder Boone has not noticed himself, though I suppose a man does not easily see what he does not wish to see." Simon set down his spoon, his appetite gone entirely. "What would you have me do, Mrs. Voss? Boone is my friend. He has given me work and shelter and never once treated me poorly. I will not betray him for a feeling that may pass with time." "Feelings like that do not pass, Simon," Hattie said quietly. "I buried a husband I loved for 30 years, and I promise you that kind of feeling does not simply pass. But I will tell you this much, since you seem determined to be noble about it. The longer this goes unspoken, the more people it will hurt when it finally comes to light. Better a hard conversation now than a broken heart later, for all three of you." Simon did not sleep well that night, turning Hattie's words over in his mind like stones in a creek bed, searching for some smooth path through them that would not end in someone's pain. He found none, and in the gray light of morning, resolved simply to be more careful, to withdraw from Lydia's company as much as propriety allowed, to let whatever had grown between them wither quietly for lack of tending. It was a resolve that lasted precisely 11 days. Until the afternoon, a rider came in from the eastern range with news that changed everything. The rider was a young hand named Tobias Reyes, barely 19 and still new enough to ranch work that his hands blistered easily despite the winter cold, and he came into the yard at a gallop that scattered chickens and brought Hattie Voss to the cookhouse door with a wooden spoon still in her hand. "Mr. Boone has fallen," Tobias called out, his voice cracking with the effort of shouting and the fear plain in his young face. "His horse went down on the ice crossing the North Creek, and he is hurt bad, ma'am. We need the wagon and someone who knows doctoring." Lydia came out of the main house at the sound of the commotion, her face going pale as she heard the news, and within minutes the yard was a controlled chaos of men saddling horses and hitching the wagon, Simon among them, his own fear for his friend momentarily overriding every other complicated feeling in his chest. They found Boone a mile up the North Creek, half conscious in the snow where his horse had thrown him after slipping on ice hidden beneath fresh powder. His leg was broken badly, the bone visibly wrong beneath his trousers, and a gash above his eye had bled freely down the side of his face before the cold had slowed it. He was alive, and conscious enough to grunt in pain as they loaded him carefully onto the wagon bed, but it was clear even to Simon's untrained eye that the injury was severe. They brought him to the house, and Lydia proved herself in that crisis every bit as capable as she had claimed in her very first letter to Boone, months before, setting the leg with the help of old Hattie Voss's rough medical knowledge, while Simon held Boone steady and murmured what comfort he could. It was grim, brutal work, Boone's hoarse cries filling the small bedroom as the bone was set and splinted, and by the time it was finished, all three of them were exhausted, and Boone had passed into a fitful, fevered sleep. "He will need weeks to heal," Hattie said quietly, wiping her hands on her apron as she surveyed her work. "Weeks in that bed, unable to work, unable to do much of anything. It will be hard on him." "It will be harder on him not to work than the pain of the leg itself," Lydia said, and there was a weariness in her voice that spoke of more than just the physical exhaustion of the afternoon. She was right. The weeks that followed tested Boone's patience nearly as much as they tested his body. A man who had spent his whole life in motion, riding fence lines and working cattle from before dawn until after dark, found himself confined to a bed, dependent on others for the smallest tasks, and the frustration of it soured his temper in ways that grieved Lydia to witness. Simon took on much of the ranch's daily management during those weeks, in addition to his usual bookkeeping duties, and found himself at the main house more often than ever, discussing herd counts and supply orders with Boone through the bedroom door, and inevitably crossing paths with Lydia in the kitchen or the hallway, their careful distance eroding a little more with each necessary encounter. It was on one such evening, some 3 weeks into Boone's recovery, that the truth finally came to light, though not in the manner Simon had ever imagined or feared. Boone had asked Simon to write one more letter, though not to Lydia this time but to Boone's aging mother back in Missouri, informing her of the accident and reassuring her that he was healing well. Simon had brought the finished letter to the bedroom for Boone's approval, reading it aloud as he always did, and Lydia had been present, mending a shirt by the window, half listening as she worked. "That is fine, Simon," Boone said when the reading was finished. "You always know just how to say things so my mother will not fret over much." "It is a gift he has," Lydia said quietly, not looking up from her sewing, "knowing just how to say things." Something in her tone made Boone glance at her, and then at Simon, a flicker of confusion crossing his broad, honest face. "Lydia, is something troubling you?" Lydia set down her sewing slowly, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with something that might have been anger or might have been grief. Simon could not tell which. "I have been meaning to ask you something, Garrett, for some weeks now, and I find I can no longer hold my tongue about it." "Ask me anything," Boone said. "The garden," Lydia said. "The line in your second letter about hope growing there before anything else did. Do you remember writing that? Do you remember what it felt like to think of me turning the soil and to wish for spring?" Boone's face went carefully blank, the way it always did when he was uncertain of his footing, and Simon felt his stomach drop through the floor, understanding with sudden, horrible clarity where this conversation was heading. "I remember the letter," Boone said slowly. "I told Simon what I wished to say and he found the words for it." "Did you tell him to speak of a garden, of hope growing there?" Lydia's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the voice of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Or did you simply tell him you wished to say something kind and leave the rest to his own imagination?" The silence in the room stretched long and painful, and Simon stood frozen near the doorway, the finished letter to Boone's mother still in his hand, unable to speak, unable to move, watching the truth unspool between husband and wife like a rope pulled taut to breaking. "I told him the second," Boone admitted finally, his voice heavy with shame. "Lydia, I have never had the words for such things. I never have. Simon has always helped me say what I feel when I cannot find the shape of it myself, but I meant every feeling behind those words, even if the words themselves were his. And when you spoke of watching me in the garden at dusk," Lydia's voice cracked slightly on the question, "of hearing me laugh at the dog chasing its tail, those were things you told him to say as well." Boone's silence this time was answer enough, and Lydia turned slowly to look at Simon standing in the doorway, and the expression on her face, the mixture of hurt and betrayal and something else Simon could not name, something that looked almost like recognition, undid him more completely than any anger could have. "You wrote that I laughed at the dog chasing its tail," she said, very quietly, "because you watched me laugh at the dog chasing its tail. Not because Garrett told you to say it. Is that not so, Simon?" There was no lie left that could serve him now, no smoothing of edges that would make this moment easier for anyone in the room. "Yes," Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is so." Lydia stood, the shirt she had been mending falling forgotten to the floor, and walked past Simon without another word, out of the bedroom and out of the house entirely, into the cold February evening, and Simon looked at Boone lying broken and betrayed in the bed, and felt the full weight of what he had done finally settle upon him. "I am sorry, Garrett," Simon said. "I never meant for this to happen. I only meant to help you." "I know it," Boone said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a deep and terrible weariness. "I asked you to write the words, Simon. I cannot fault you for writing them well." But I think he stopped, his jaw working, and when he continued, his voice had gone rough with something that might have been tears, though Simon did not look closely enough to be certain. "I think perhaps I always knew, some part of me, that the words in those letters were not entirely mine. I think perhaps that is why I could never speak them myself, even when I tried. They were never mine to speak." "What will you do?" Simon asked, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. "I do not know," Boone said. "Go after her, Simon. Someone should. My leg will not carry me, and it should not be Hattie who finds her out there alone in the cold. Go and see that she is safe, at least. Whatever else must be settled between us can wait until morning." Simon found her at the edge of the north pasture, standing beneath the same cottonwood tree he had once told Boone she might like to sit beneath, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her breath coming in ragged clouds in the fading light. He approached slowly, giving her every opportunity to send him away, but she did not turn or speak as he came to stand a respectful distance from her. "Lydia," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that he feared she might simply walk away from him too, "I am sorry. I never meant to deceive you. I only meant to help a friend say what he could not say himself." "You did not deceive me about Garrett's feelings," Lydia said, her voice tight with an emotion she was clearly fighting to control. "I believe he does care for me in his own way, in whatever way he is capable. What you deceived me about, Simon, was whose heart I was actually falling in love with when I read those letters." The words struck him like a physical blow, and he found he had no answer for them, no defense that would not simply confirm the very thing she had accused him of. "Every word about the garden," she continued, turning now to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears in the dying light. "About watching me at dusk, about the dog. Those were not Garrett's feelings dressed up in your words, were they? Those were your feelings, wearing Garrett's name like a borrowed coat." "Lydia," Simon said, her name breaking on his tongue like something precious and forbidden. "I never meant for it to happen. I told myself for months that I was only being a good friend, only smoothing his words, but I think," he stopped, forced himself to continue, understanding that whatever pain came from honesty now was owed to her after months of unwitting deception. "I think I fell in love with you the very first time I read your letter aloud to Garrett, before you ever set foot in this territory. I think every word I wrote after that was true, but it was never true on Garrett's behalf. It was only ever true on my own." Lydia made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, a sound of a woman confronting an absurdity too large and too painful to simply cry over. "I married a man I had never met," she said, "believing I knew his heart from his letters, and I find now that the heart I knew was never his at all. What am I to do with that, Simon? What am I to do with loving words that were never spoken by the man who stood beside me at the altar?" "I do not know," Simon admitted. "I have asked myself the same question every night for months, and I have found no answer that does not end in someone's heart breaking. Garrett is my friend. He has given me everything I have in this territory. And you are his wife, bound to him by vows spoken before God and witnesses, whatever the tangled truth behind the courtship that brought you to those vows." "He knows," Lydia said quietly. "He must know now what you have just told me." "He does," Simon said. "I think, in some way, he has known for longer than either of us realized. He told me just before I came looking for you that some part of him always suspected the words in those letters were not entirely his own." They stood together beneath the cottonwood as the last light faded from the sky, close enough that Simon could see the tears finally spill down her cheeks, and every instinct in him strained toward comforting her, toward closing the distance between them and offering whatever comfort his arms might provide. But he held himself still, understanding that anything more between them now, in this moment, before anything had been properly settled with Boone, would only compound the wrong he had already done. "I should go back," Lydia said finally, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her voice steadying by degrees. "Garrett is injured and needs tending, whatever else stands unresolved between us. I will not abandon a man in his sickbed, whatever complications lie in my heart. That is a kindness he does not deserve to lose," Simon said quietly, "whatever else has come to light tonight." They walked back to the house together in silence, and Simon left her at the door, watching her disappear inside to tend to the husband whose vows she had spoken in good faith, believing him to be someone he was not. And Simon walked back to his own small room feeling as though he had opened a door that could never again be closed, whatever came of it. The days that followed were among the hardest Simon had ever lived through. He continued his work, managing the ranch's affairs during Boone's recovery, but the easy camaraderie that had once existed between the two men had been replaced by something careful and strained, both of them navigating around the truth that now lay exposed between them like a wound neither knew how to dress. Lydia, for her part, remained dutiful in her care of her husband, but Simon noticed, with a guilt that never quite left him, that something essential had gone out of the household, some warmth that had existed even in the difficult early weeks of the marriage now conspicuously absent. It was Boone himself who finally forced the matter to its resolution, some 10 days after the confrontation beneath the cottonwood, calling Simon into his bedroom on a cold morning when Lydia had gone to help Hattie Voss with the wash. "Sit down, Simon," Boone said, and though his leg remained splinted and his movements were limited, there was a clarity in his eyes that morning that had not been there since the accident. "We must speak plainly, you and I would rather do it while Lydia is occupied elsewhere." Simon sat in the chair beside the bed, bracing himself for whatever accusation or anger Boone had been storing up during his days of enforced stillness, but what came instead surprised him entirely. "I have had a great deal of time to think, lying here," Boone said. "More time than I have had to think about anything in years, and I have come to a conclusion that I believe you will find surprising, though I hope you will also find it honest. I am listening, Garrett. I do not believe Lydia and I would have suited each other, even without your letters," Boone said slowly, choosing each word with the same careful deliberation he had once used to dictate his courtship. "I have watched her these months, Simon. I have watched how she comes alive discussing figures and accounts, how her mind moves quick as a hawk when there is a problem to solve. I have watched, too, how she goes quiet and careful around me, how she speaks to me as one might speak to a kind stranger, polite and warm but never entirely at ease. I do not believe that is a marriage built to last, whatever affection lies between us. I think, perhaps, I always sensed it, even before your confession beneath the cottonwood tree that Tobias Reyes was foolish enough to tell half the bunkhouse about." Simon felt his face heat at the reminder that their conversation had apparently not gone entirely unwitnessed. "Garrett, I never intended. I know what you intended, and I know what you did not intend," Boone interrupted, not unkindly. "I have turned this over from every angle a broken leg and a guilty conscience can provide, and I have come to believe that the greatest wrong here was not yours in writing feelings you did not have the right to write, but mine in asking a man to court a woman on my behalf when I lacked the courage to court her honestly myself, in my own halting words, however poor they might have sounded beside yours. What are you saying, Garrett?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling of the small bedroom, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough with an emotion Simon had rarely heard from him. "I am saying that I release her, Simon. Not easily and not without grief, for she is a fine woman and I have come to care for her in my own clumsy way. But I will not hold a woman to vows made under a false understanding of the man she was marrying, and I will not stand in the way of a happiness that I believe in my heart was never truly meant to include me. There are laws," Simon said carefully, his heart pounding at what Boone seemed to be suggesting. "A marriage cannot simply be undone because feelings have changed. There is more than one kind of law," Boone said. "There is the law of the territory, and I will speak with Reverend Whitfield about what might be possible on that front, whether an annulment might be sought given the deception involved in the courtship, however unintentional it was on your part. But there is also the law of what is right, Simon, and I believe what is right is for that woman to build a life with the man whose heart she has already given hers to, whatever paper stands between them at present." Tears stood unexpectedly in Simon's eyes, and he found he could not speak for a long moment, humbled by the generosity of a man he had wronged, however unwittingly, and who now offered forgiveness and freedom in the same rough, honest breath. "You are a better man than I have been to you, Garrett," Simon said finally. "I am a man who has had a great deal of time to think," Boone said, and something almost like a smile touched his weathered face. "And I am a man who would rather see 2 people happy than see 3 people miserable out of stubborn pride. Go and speak with Reverend Whitfield yourself, Simon. I will speak with Lydia when she returns. This is not a conversation to be had second-hand, whatever role you played in bringing us to this point." The conversation that followed between Boone and Lydia was one Simon was not present for, and he never asked either of them for its exact words, understanding that some moments belonged to the people who lived them, and not to the story that might later be told of them. What he knew was that Lydia emerged from the house that evening with her eyes red from crying but her shoulders set with a determination he had come to recognize as entirely her own, and she found him in the small office where the letters had first been written, sitting at the desk with his head in his hands. "Garrett has spoken with the Reverend already," she said, standing in the doorway. "There are grounds, apparently, given the circumstances of the courtship, though it will take some weeks and perhaps a journey to the territorial court to see it properly settled. He has been more generous than I had any right to expect." "He is a good man," Simon said, looking up at her. "Better than I deserve as a friend, given what I have done." "He told me something else," Lydia said, coming further into the room, "which I believe he intended for you to hear as much as for me. He said that a man who writes such letters, who watches a woman closely enough to know how she laughs at a foolish dog, who dreams of gardens and hope in the same breath, is not a man given to careless deception. He said he believed you loved truly, even if the manner of it was crooked and confused from the start." Simon stood, crossing the small room to stand before her, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion and the hope warring in her gray eyes. "I did love truly," he said. "I love you still, Lydia, more than I have ever loved anything in my life, and I have spent months believing that love was a thing I would have to carry alone and in silence for the rest of my days." "You will not have to carry it alone," Lydia said, and the words came out on a breath that was half laugh, half sob, relief and hope finally breaking through months of confusion and grief. "I fell in love with a man's words before I ever knew his face, Simon Underwood, and I have come to learn that the words and the face and the heart behind them were always the same man, however tangled the path that brought us together. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise." He kissed her then, finally, in the small office where it had all begun, months of longing and guilt and careful restraint dissolving into something simple and true, and outside the window, the last light of a Wyoming winter afternoon fell golden across the hills, promising, as it always did, that spring would come again in its own good time. The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties, for the territory of Wyoming, like most frontier communities, held firm opinions about the sanctity of marriage, and the process of untangling Lydia's union with Garrett Boone required patience, paperwork, and no small amount of explaining before the territorial judge in Cheyenne. A stern man named Judge Elias Pratt, who listened to the whole strange tale with an expression of increasing bewilderment before finally granting the annulment on grounds of fraudulent representation in the courtship, a legal technicality that Reverend Whitfield had helped identify, and that satisfied the letter of the law even if it could not entirely capture the tangled truth of hearts and letters and misdirected love. Boone himself testified before the judge, a fact that moved Simon nearly to tears when he learned of it, standing before the bench in his good coat with his splinted leg still stiff beneath him, explaining in his own halting, honest words that he had asked a friend to court a bride on his behalf because he lacked the words himself, and that the friend's words had won a heart that had never truly been his own to claim. "I do not fault the young lady for loving what was offered to her," Boone told the judge, and Simon, sitting in the small gallery, felt his throat tighten at the plain dignity of the man's testimony. "I fault only my own foolish pride, in believing another man's words could stand in for my own heart without consequence. I ask the court to set her free of any wrong done to her in this matter, for she has done nothing wrong at all." The annulment was granted in the spring of 1879, and Lydia Collins found herself, for the second time in less than a year, a woman without a husband, but this time by her own choosing and with her heart entirely intact, given freely rather than lost through deception. Boone, for his part, remained foreman of the Bar K, and though there was an awkwardness between the three of them that took some months to fully ease, the essential decency of the man ensured that no lasting bitterness poisoned what had once been friendship. "I will find my own wife eventually," Boone told Simon one evening, some months later, as the two men sat on the porch of the bunkhouse watching the sun set over the hills. "Perhaps I will learn my letters properly this time, so I might write my own courtship without borrowing another man's pen. Hattie has offered to teach me, if you can believe it, in exchange for my help mending her henhouse each week. I believe old dogs can learn new tricks if the teacher is patient enough," Simon said, smiling. "Hattie Voss has patience enough for a dozen old dogs," Boone said, and there was genuine warmth in his laugh, warmth that told Simon their friendship, though changed by all that had passed between them, had survived and might yet grow stronger for having weathered such a storm. Simon and Lydia were married in June of 1879, in the same small clapboard church in Larkspur where she had first married Boone, though this time the ceremony felt entirely different, charged with a joy that had been earned through honesty rather than borrowed words. Boone himself gave Lydia away, standing in for the family she no longer had, and the gesture moved half the small congregation to tears, a testament to the strange and winding path that had brought all three of them to a place of peace. "You are certain," Lydia asked Simon quietly as they stood together at the altar, "that these words at least are entirely your own?" "Every single one," Simon said, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it, one honest word at a time." Reverend Whitfield pronounced them husband and wife, and this time, when Simon kissed his bride, there was no distance in her eyes at all, only a certainty that had taken nearly a year of confusion and heartbreak to arrive at, but that felt, in that moment, as solid and permanent as the mountains rising blue and eternal on the horizon beyond the little church. They built their own small house that summer, on a modest parcel of land Boone had helped them secure at the edge of the Bar K's boundary, close enough that Simon could continue his work managing the ranch's accounts, far enough that it was entirely their own place, belonging to no one's history but theirs. Lydia planted her garden in the good black soil behind the house, the garden that had once existed only in a letter written by the wrong man's hand, and this time when things grew there in the golden light of a Wyoming summer, they grew from seeds she had planted herself, in soil she had chosen herself, for a husband whose words had been entirely his own from the very first day she had truly known him. Hattie Voss took to visiting every week, ostensibly to check on Boone's progress with his letters, though everyone understood the visits had as much to do with the warmth she had come to feel for the young couple who had found their way to happiness through such an unlikely path. She brought preserves and gossip, and on more than one occasion, a bottle of something stronger than coffee to celebrate whatever small milestone the ranch had reached that week, and her presence became a fixture of their new household, a reminder that family was not always a thing one was born into, but sometimes a thing one built, choice by choice, kindness by kindness. Boone did learn his letters that summer, slow and stubborn work that occupied his evenings for months, Hattie's patience proving as vast as she had promised, and by autumn he could manage a rough but legible signature, a fact that filled him with such pride that he practiced it on every scrap of paper in the bunkhouse, until the other hands teased him mercilessly about it, teasing he bore with unusual good humor given how hard-won the skill had been. "I will write my own courtship next time," Boone announced to Simon one evening, showing off a labored but genuine letter he had composed himself to a widow named Constance Ferris, who ran a boarding house in Larkspur and had caught his eye at a church social some weeks prior. Every clumsy word of it my own, and if she cannot love a plain man who says plain things plainly, then she is not the woman meant for me. I believe any woman would be fortunate to receive such honest words, Simon said, and meant it entirely, watching his friend's earnest pride with a warmth that had, by that point, fully healed the old guilt between them. Constance Ferris, as it turned out, was precisely the sort of woman who valued plain honesty above polished phrases, and by the following spring, Boone found himself married again, this time with words entirely his own, however roughly formed, and the whole strange history of the Bar K's tangled courtships became, in time, a story told with laughter around the ranch's cook fairs rather than one spoken of with any lingering shame. Lydia, meanwhile, had found her true calling not merely as a rancher's wife, but as something the territory had rarely seen, a woman who managed accounts and correspondence for half the ranches in the county, her skill with figures and her clear, steady penmanship earning her a reputation that spread from Larkspur to the surrounding settlements. Simon watched with quiet pride as men who might once have dismissed a woman's mind for such work came instead to seek her out specifically, understanding that her sums were reliable in a way few others in the territory could match. "You have built something here that has nothing to do with me," Simon told her one evening, watching her balance a stack of ledgers by lamplight, her brow furrowed in the particular way it did when she was working through a difficult problem. "I built it with you," Lydia corrected him gently, looking up from her work. "You taught me to trust that my words, my mind, were worth something in this world. I do not believe I would have found the courage to offer my services so openly if I had not first learned, through you, that honesty and skill could be their own kind of worth, regardless of what the world expected of a woman." Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1880, nearly a full year after their wedding, and they named him Garrett, a choice that moved Boone to tears when they told him, though he tried gruffly to hide it behind a cough and a sudden interest in his coffee cup. "You did not have to do that," Boone said, though his voice was thick with emotion. "We wanted to," Simon said simply. "Whatever tangled path brought the three of us together, you were the beginning of it, Garrett, and a good man deserves to be remembered kindly by the family his own generosity helped make possible." Their second child, a daughter they named after Lydia's mother, Margaret, arrived 2 years later, and by then the small house at the edge of the Bar K had grown warm with the particular chaos of small children. Lydia's garden had expanded to feed not only their own table but to share with neighboring families in lean seasons, and Simon had begun, in his spare hours, to write down the story of their courtship, not for publication, but simply because he had come to believe that some stories deserved to be preserved in the same careful, honest words that had first brought two hearts together across the distance of an unfamiliar territory. "Will you tell them the whole truth of it?" Lydia asked him once, watching him write by lamplight while their son slept in the next room, "when they are old enough to understand that their mother nearly married the wrong man, and their father wrote the words that won her heart under a borrowed name?" "I will tell them the truth," Simon said, "because I believe the truth of it in the end is a fine thing to know. That love found through honest words, however crooked the path that carries them, is worth more than any easy courtship built on convenience alone. That a man can make a mistake, as I did, and still find his way to something true if he is willing to face the wrong he has done and make it right." "And Garrett Boone," Lydia asked, "how will you tell them of him?" "As the finest kind of friend," Simon said, without hesitation. "A man generous enough to release a happiness he might have kept for himself because he believed rightly that it belonged elsewhere. I do not believe our children could ask for a better example of what true friendship looks like, whatever complicated history brought us all to this point." The Bar K prospered through the 1880s, weathering the hard winter of 1886 that devastated so many cattle operations across the territory through careful management that owed much to Lydia's steady hand on the ranch's books. And by the time their third child arrived, another son they named Wendell after Lydia's uncle, who had softened considerably toward his niece. Once, he understood the full and rather remarkable story of how she had come to find happiness in Wyoming. The Underwood family had become as much a fixture of the Larkspur community as the church itself. Simon continued his work with letters for years afterward, though never again another man's courtship, teaching instead any hand on the ranch who wished to learn their letters. A small school he ran on Sunday afternoons that eventually grew into something like a proper institution, with children from neighboring ranches riding in to learn their sums and their reading alongside the rough cowhands who had once been too proud or too ashamed to admit their own illiteracy. Boone and Constance settled comfortably into the boarding house in Larkspur, Boone eventually stepping back from the daily grind of ranch work as his old injury made the cold mornings harder to bear, though he remained close friends with Simon and Lydia for the whole of his long life. A fixture at every birthday and holiday gathering, the children calling him Uncle Garrett with an affection that made the strange history of their parents' courtship feel, in time, like nothing more than the opening chapter of a much longer and happier story. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Simon and Lydia sat together on the porch of the house they had built with their own hands, watching their 4 children, for a fourth had arrived 2 years after Wendell, a daughter named Hattie after the woman who had first seen the truth of Simon's heart before he had been brave enough to see it himself, chase fireflies across the darkening yard. "Do you ever think," Lydia asked, leaning her head against Simon's shoulder as the last light faded from the sky, "of what our lives might have been if you had simply written Garrett's words as he gave them to you, plain and unadorned, and never let your own heart bleed into the ink?" "I think of it sometimes," Simon admitted. "I think we might have lived a quiet, ordinary life, you as Garrett's wife and I as his bookkeeper, and perhaps we would have found a measure of contentment in that, never knowing what we were missing. But I do not believe it would have been half so fine as what we have built instead." "No," Lydia agreed softly, watching their children's laughter carry across the yard in the deepening dusk. "I do not believe it would have been." The stars came out slowly over the Wyoming hills, the same stars that had watched over that first fateful letter, sealed with candle wax and carried by a nervous foreman's own hand to a small office where a young scribe had first put pen to paper, never guessing the words he wrote would carry him, eventually, to exactly the life he had never known he wanted until it was already, impossibly, entirely his own. Simon Underwood had come west searching for land, for some patch of earth he might call his own, and had found instead something far more valuable, a woman whose heart he had won through honest words even when the circumstances of their meeting had been built on an accidental deception, and a friendship with a man generous enough to set aside his own happiness for the sake of a truth larger than pride. In the end, the letters that had begun as another man's courtship had become the foundation of Simon's own true love story, proof, if any were needed, that words written from an honest heart find their way, eventually, to exactly where they are meant to be, however tangled and uncertain the path that carries them there. And in the small clapboard church in Larkspur, the same church where Lydia Collins had once become Lydia Boone and later, more truly, Lydia Underwood, the Reverend Whitfield would sometimes tell the story to young couples come to be married, of the foreman who could not write, the scribe who could not stop, and the bride who fell in love with words before she ever knew whose heart had truly written them. A cautionary tale, perhaps, about honesty in courtship, but more than that. A testament to the strange and winding ways that love finds its way home, even when the path there runs through another man's name entirely. The ranch prospered, the children grew, and on quiet evenings for the rest of their long and happy lives together, Simon would still, on occasion, write Lydia a letter, though now he needed no other man's name to sign at the bottom, no borrowed courtship to carry his true feelings across any distance at all. For the distance between their two hearts had long since closed entirely, leaving nothing between them but the simple, steady truth of a love that had survived its own complicated beginning to become, in the end, exactly as fine and lasting as those first stolen words had promised it might be.